So looking back this last weekend to this year's International Men's Day, I guess there was some progress of some sort in that the debate this year was held in the main Chamber of Parliament here in the UK, whereas before it was relegated to a back room somewhere. However, hardly anyone stayed, which was a little odd to me because the debate directly beforehand had been about disabled benefits and problems and so on, and the International Men's Day debate was primarily about suicide rates and mental health. So the two topics would seem to be fairly intimately intertwined, but nobody really stayed on for the debate. Now the Women's Day debates are fairly empty as well, to be honest, so I'm not that upset, but there is a marked difference between the attendance between the two. Well, Jess Phillips was absent, and the spokesperson on behalf of International Men's Day was Philip Davies, a Conservative MP. He's not who I would choose for my spokesman, and indeed I would tend to think that the Conservatives are, in part, what's got us into this mess with their cutbacks in the NHS and various other issues that they've created over the years. The loss of jobs and so on, and secure housing can very much be laid at the feet of the Conservatives, but you know, he's the spokesperson we've got, so I guess that we'll have to make do. It's telling somewhat that the problems are so controversial that only a right-wing MP would speak out on them, even though they're not right-wing issues, and at the same time so egregious that a member of the Nasty Party would see that there's enough of a problem that it needs talking about. Very strange. The debate was disappointing to watch. While there were a few good moments, again, they were from people that one would not expect to speak up on behalf of equality and issues such as health and so on. Equally, you would not expect members of the SNP or the Labour Party, nominally left-wing parties, to be the ones so critical of people's pain and death and suffering. You would think that they would be the ones speaking up to advocate for such victims and to be speaking in favour of equality, but that's not what we see at all. Quite the opposite. Indeed, SNP MP, Taslima Ahmed Sheikh, I think her name was, dropped all the usual dismissing buzzwords pretty much in one sentence. In one sentence we had toxic masculinity and patriarchy, and all the other trite nonsense that we hear in order to dismiss men's issues. It's been suicide 2 years in a row now. I think it's time we talked about something else, but the sheer fact of the matter is that the suicide statistics are so horrifying. There is such a divergence between the rate of female suicide and the rate of male suicide that it cannot help but arrest the attention of even the most die-hard gender ideologue. They're able to see that there is a problem here. But then they blame men in a way that they would not blame women. You see all kinds of pushback, rightly so, against victim blaming, against slut shaming and so on when it comes to women. But when it comes to men's mental health and men's distress and men's problems, very rapidly you see men being blamed for it, being told to modify their behaviour, that the world owes them nothing, that they should be treated as broken women rather than men, and the way to correct their behaviour is to feminise their behaviour. Yeah, oh, you're killing yourself because of toxic masculinity, by which most commentators simply mean masculinity. Yeah, I'm hardly the most masculine man, but I've found that approach does not work. even I, as a less masculine man, as a touchy-feely, nerdy, geeky type, find talk therapy, for example, to be virtually useless. And I hear the same from a lot of other men. You know, it takes longer for us to open up, we're less comfortable with it, it feels like pressure, it can aggravate the issues that you already have. Whereas alternative approaches, more practical approaches, goal-oriented approaches, ways that you can see and feel and measure that you're making progress, or where you can distract yourself or do something else, these seem to be more effective. But no, even the most well-meaning people fixate upon the idea that men need to talk about their feelings more, you know, that it's okay to cry. I mean, men and women are physically different in our tear ducts. Yeah, we're biologically different right down to lacrimation. It's bizarre in that context, unless I guess you're a social constructivist who believes that biology has nothing to do with it and evolutionary psychology has nothing to do with it. But it's bizarre otherwise to think that treating men like women will help them in any way, or trying to force men to behave like women will help somehow. And obviously there's a bell curve, and I'm talking about the center of the bell curve, and there are men who are hypermasculine and there are men who are feminine. But, you know, talking more broadly, we have to talk about that bulge in the bell curve. So I'm not excluding anyone, I'm just trying to speak as broadly as possible, given the nature of this debate and this problem. You know, I think next year we need to talk about education. I think that is the next biggest problem, and it's probably one where the statistics are as solid, or nearly as solid, as we find them in the suicide statistics. You know, boys are failing at school. It just doesn't fit that normal narrative, you know, that men are somehow the great success stories. Well, some men are. Men tend to succeed or fail hard in either direction, but people fixate upon that top 1% of successes and forget about the homeless and the jobless and the prisoners. You know, the guys that try and fail get left behind and aren't noticed, and people fixate upon the relatively tiny percentage of men that succeed really hard through their risk-taking, and they see them as somehow representative of men as a whole, of some kind of male privilege, whereas they don't look at all those men, the much greater percentage of men that fail hard in life and are suffering. They don't look at them and see them as the example of men. The biggest resistance you tend to find tends to actually come from men. You look at International Women's Day, and sure, you get your trolls, but by and large the disagreement there is not so much dismissal, but an argument that men too are suffering, or criticism of debunked ideas such as rape culture or the wage gap. Whereas when it comes to International Men's Day, you tend to run into outright denial. There is trolling, that's mostly from men, but the dismissal tends to come from women. And there's a lot of deflecting to try and make it about women's issues, which is different from saying men suffer too, which is what you tend to see from men on International Women's Day. And the treatment of men on Men's Day is perhaps some sort of justification for this pushback on Women's Day. I mean, men's problems are being ignored. Women have departments, they have charities, they have spokesmen in government. Men don't. But it's that old joke, isn't it, that every day is International Men's Day? Well, it isn't. Men may be the majority of people running the world, but they don't seem to be running it for men. One need only look at the statistics to see that, to see how men are suffering and failing, and their problems are being ignored, even their deaths are being ignored. While women's issues, women's problems, women's disparities have been all but eliminated in the West, and what remains is a mere husk. Even on rights issues, women have more rights than men in the West now. Men have no reproductive rights. Men's genitals aren't protected by law from being cut apart. Courts are biased against them, there's a sentencing gap, and when it comes to family court, men 80% of the time don't get the custody of their kids. Indeed, are advised not to challenge for custody of their kids because they'll lose. These are real issues, but very few people are willing to discuss them. And this day made very little difference to that. There's progress, but it's glacial. It's glacial and it's disappointing. And I think we all need to do a great deal better. It was disappointing. It was upsetting. Hopefully next year will be better. Zang.